Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you powerful tales of courage, resilience, and the human spirit. Today's story takes us to a quiet cemetery where an overlooked elderly man, Mr. Johnson, stands alone at a funeral. What begins as a day of silent judgment transforms into a revelation that shocks everyone, reminding us of the unseen heroes among us. This is a story of bravery, redemption, and the importance of seeing beyond appearances. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Life Stories to begin today's inspiring journey. Let's dive into this unforgettable tale together. The cemetery was serene, its tranquility broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hum of passing traffic. It was the kind of place that seemed to exist outside of time, a space where grief could be shared and solace sought. Yet, amidst the clusters of mourners exchanging quiet words of comfort and shedding tears, one man stood apart. Mr. Johnson, an elderly African-American man, clutched a worn hat in his weathered hands. His suit, though neatly pressed, bore the signs of age, frayed edges, and a slightly faded fabric. He kept a respectful distance from the gathering, his posture straight but not rigid, his expression unreadable. His gaze was fixed on the casket, as though the answers to unspoken questions lay within its polished wood. Around him, conversations flowed effortlessly. There was a mix of soft laughter and tears as people shared memories of the deceased, a beloved man whose life had clearly touched many. But no one approached Mr. Johnson. A few stole quick glances his way, their expressions betraying curiosity tinged with discomfort. Others avoided looking at him altogether, as though his mere presence disrupted the fragile balance of the moment. From the corner of his eye, Mr. Johnson noticed a woman lean toward her companion, her voice low but clear enough to reach him. "What's he doing here?" The words cut through the air like a knife, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he straightened his back slightly and tightened his grip on the hat. His face remained calm, betraying none of the turmoil stirring inside. He wanted to step forward, to claim his place among the mourners, but the weight of their unspoken judgment held him back. So he stayed where he was, rooted to the spot, his thoughts a swirl of memories and emotions. There was sadness in his eyes, but there was something deeper, too, a quiet resolve that hinted at a story untold. He didn't belong here, or so the mourners seemed to believe. Yet, he couldn't leave. He was tied to this funeral, to the man being laid to rest, in ways that no one else could understand. As the preacher began to speak, Mr. Johnson lingered at the edge of the crowd. His eyes scanned the faces of the mourners, noting how they leaned on one another for support. Words of comfort were exchanged freely, hands clasped in solidarity, but none of that camaraderie was extended to him. He adjusted his jacket and took a tentative step closer, only to be met with subtle shifts in body language, a turned shoulder here, a sidelong glance there. It was enough to remind him that he wasn't truly welcome. The preacher's voice carried through the cemetery, warm and heartfelt. He spoke of the deceased's life, a man who had achieved much and was cherished by his community. At the mention of the man's name, Mr. Johnson's expression softened, a faint smile flickering across his lips. But the moment was fleeting, unnoticed by the others. Instead, a woman from the front row turned to look at him briefly, her brow furrowing before she whispered something to her neighbor. Both women glanced his way, their eyes narrowing in silent judgment before returning their attention to the preacher. Mr. Johnson shifted his weight uncomfortably, trying to blend into the background. He thought about leaving, about sparing himself the sting of their dismissal. But his gaze returned to the casket, and he knew he couldn't walk away, not yet. There was something unspoken that needed to be acknowledged, a truth buried alongside the man they were mourning. Earlier that day, his journey to the cemetery had been uneventful at first. He had driven along quiet roads, his mind drifting through memories, when the sudden flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror jolted him back to the present. He pulled over, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as an officer approached his car. "License and registration," the officer barked, his tone curt and unwelcoming. Mr. Johnson handed over the documents without protest, his voice calm as he replied, "Yes, sir." The officer studied the papers, his gaze shifting to Mr. Johnson with a hint of suspicion. "What's a guy like you doing out here?" he asked, his words heavy with insinuation. "I'm on my way to a funeral," Mr. Johnson said simply, his hands resting on the steering wheel in plain sight. The officer smirked, his eyes scanning the car as though expecting to find something incriminating. "A funeral? Huh. Fancy place for someone like you. You sure you're at the right one?" Mr. Johnson didn't respond. He stared straight ahead, his expression calm but firm. After a moment, the officer handed back his papers with a dismissive wave. "Don't cause any trouble," he muttered before walking away. The encounter lingered in Mr. Johnson's mind as he stood at the cemetery. He thought about the officer's words, about how easily people dismissed him without knowing who he was or what he'd done. It wasn't the first time, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Yet, despite everything, he stayed. There was a reason he was here, a connection that couldn't be ignored. As the service continued, Mr. Johnson remained on the outskirts, a silent observer. His presence went unnoticed by most, but the weight of his story hung in the air, waiting to be told. For now, he stood quietly, his hat in hand and his heart heavy with memories. He was invisible to the mourners, but the casket before him held the key to a truth that would soon demand to be seen. As the preacher's words resonated through the gathering, Mr. Johnson stood still, his hat clenched tightly in his hands. The sermon painted a glowing picture of the deceased, a beloved community figure, a devoted family man, and someone whose life had inspired those around him. But for Mr. Johnson, these words held a deeper weight. Each sentence seemed to echo in his mind, pulling him back to a time long forgotten by everyone except himself. The mourners nodded along, their faces reflecting a mix of grief and pride. Occasionally, a few glanced at Mr. Johnson, their eyes lingering with curiosity but never venturing close enough to engage him. Their distance, both physical and emotional, was a quiet reminder of the barriers that separated him from this group. Barriers built not from words but from unspoken prejudices and assumptions. Mr. Johnson's thoughts drifted. He remembered a different time, a different place. It was years ago. In the chaos of war, the heat was suffocating, the air thick with smoke and the constant sound of gunfire. He could still feel the weight of the man he carried on his shoulders, his body limp and bleeding, as he sprinted across open ground. Each step felt like an eternity, each moment filled with the terror of knowing that a single bullet could end them both. He hadn't hesitated back then. Not for a second. The man he carried, now lying in the casket before him, wasn't just a fellow soldier, he was a brother in arms. Race, rank, and background had all faded away in the face of survival. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was getting him to safety. And he had succeeded, though not without cost. The scars from that day, both visible and invisible, had stayed with Mr. Johnson ever since. The preacher's voice pulled him back to the present. "We gather here today to honor a man who lived a full life," he said, his tone warm but solemn. "But no life is truly lived alone. We are shaped not just by our own actions, but by the sacrifices and bravery of others." Mr. Johnson's breath caught, his chest tightening as a ripple of whispers passed through the crowd. The preacher's words seemed to be leading somewhere, and for the first time, the attention of the mourners began to shift. "Many of you may not know this," the preacher continued, "but during his time in the service, our brother found himself in a moment of great peril. His life hung in the balance, and it was only through the courage and selflessness of another that he was able to return home to his family." A murmur of confusion spread among the crowd. Heads turned, eyes scanning for answers. Mr. Johnson felt the weight of their gazes, but he remained frozen, his mind reeling. Could it be? Did the deceased truly remember after all these years? The preacher paused, allowing the anticipation to build. Then, with a gentle smile, he gestured toward the back of the crowd. That man, he said, his voice steady, is here with us today. All at once, every eye in the cemetery turned toward Mr. Johnson. For a moment, he felt the full force of their scrutiny. The whispers stopped, replaced by an almost deafening silence. He stood motionless, his heart pounding in his chest. The preacher continued, his voice filled with reverence. Mr. Johnson risked his own life to carry our brother to safety. Because of his bravery, the man we honor today lived to build this family, this community. And for that, we owe him a debt of gratitude. The crowd's expressions changed. The curiosity and discomfort that had marked their earlier glances were gone, replaced by something deeper: awe, respect, and even shame. For so long, Mr. Johnson had been invisible to them, a presence dismissed without a second thought. Now, in the wake of the preacher's words, he was seen for what he truly was, a hero. One by one, people began to approach him. A middle-aged woman, her eyes filled with tears, stepped forward. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know. None of us did. I'm so sorry." Another mourner, an older man, spoke up. "You're the reason he came home to us. You're the reason he lived to build this family. We owe you everything." The words washed over Mr. Johnson, both a balm and a burden. He managed to find his voice, though it was quiet and unsteady. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said, his gaze drifting toward the casket. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. He was my brother out there, and I'd do it again if I had to." The tension in the air softened, replaced by something warmer, something healing. People began to surround him, not out of judgment, but with gratitude and apologies. For the first time since he arrived, Mr. Johnson felt a sense of belonging. The weight of years of invisibility began to lift, replaced by the warmth of recognition and connection. And as the service continued, he stood tall, no longer an outsider, but a part of the story being told. As the service drew to a close, the shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. Where there had been distance and whispers, there was now warmth and reverence. Mr. Johnson stood near the casket, surrounded by mourners who had previously ignored him. Their faces were filled with a mix of awe and remorse as they pieced together the story of his bravery. A young woman, one of the deceased's grandchildren, stepped forward hesitantly. She held a photo in her hand, a faded snapshot of a group of soldiers standing in front of a makeshift barracks. Their faces youthful and determined. "This is you, isn't it?" she asked, her voice soft. She pointed to the figure standing next to her grandfather, his uniform crisp and his expression resolute. Mr. Johnson nodded, his eyes scanning the familiar image. "That was taken not long before," he began. But his voice faltered. The memories of that day were vivid in his mind, the chaos, the fear, the bond forged in the fire of survival. The young woman placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said simply, her words carrying a depth of emotion that needed no elaboration. "Thank you for giving us all the years we had with him." Around them, others murmured their agreement. One by one, mourners approached to shake his hand, to apologize for their earlier behavior, to express gratitude for the life his actions had saved. For Mr. Johnson, it was overwhelming. For so many years, he had carried the weight of his sacrifice in silence, convinced that it had been forgotten, that it had all been in vain. But now, standing here, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: acknowledgement. As the family invited him to join them at the front, he hesitated. The shift in their behavior felt genuine, but he couldn't shake the years of dismissal and judgment he had endured. Yet, when he looked at the faces around him, he saw something new, a sense of humility, of recognition. Slowly, he stepped forward, his movements deliberate but steady. Standing by the casket, he gazed down at the man whose life he had saved so many years ago. The lines on Mr. Johnson's face deepened as he spoke, his voice clear but heavy with emotion. "We served together in a time when division was everywhere," he began. "Out there, in the chaos of war, none of that mattered. We weren't black or white, we were just men. Fighting to survive. Fighting for each other." He paused, the weight of the moment settling over the crowd. "On that day, I wasn't thinking about the color of his skin or mine. I was thinking about the promise we made to each other that we'd do whatever it took to bring each other home. And that's what I did. I kept that promise." The mourners listened in silence, their attention fully on him. For the first time, Mr. Johnson felt truly seen, not just for what he had done, but for who he was. He continued, his voice gaining strength. "We live in a world that still struggles to see past the things that divide us. But in the moments that matter most, those differences don't mean a thing. What matters is how we choose to show up for each other, how we choose to see each other, how we choose to treat each other." As he stepped back, his words hung in the air, a quiet benediction that seemed to resonate deeply with everyone present. A woman who had avoided him earlier now approached, her expression filled with remorse. Without a word, she embraced him, her tears soaking into the fabric of his jacket. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for giving us him." Mr. Johnson nodded, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. The weight of years of invisibility was lifting, replaced by something he hadn't felt in decades, a sense of belonging. He looked around at the crowd, at the faces now gazing at him with respect and gratitude. And for the first time that day, he allowed himself a small, genuine smile. As the service concluded, the family invited him to join them at the wake. He hesitated again, unsure if he belonged among them. But then, the deceased son, a man in his 40s with a striking resemblance to his father, stepped forward. "Please," he said, his voice earnest. "You were more than a friend to my dad. You were his brother. You're family to us now." The words touched something deep within Mr. Johnson. He nodded, accepting the invitation, and walked with the family toward the gathering area. The weight of the past still lingered, but it felt lighter now, carried not just by him but by the community that had finally acknowledged his role in their story. As he left the cemetery, he glanced back one last time at the casket. "Rest easy, brother," he murmured under his breath. "They'll remember now." And for the first time in years, he felt at peace. As the sun set over the quiet cemetery, Mr. Johnson left with a heart lighter than it had been in decades. For years, he had carried the weight of his sacrifice alone, invisible to those who owed him so much. But today, the truth had emerged, and with it came acknowledgement, gratitude, and a long overdue sense of belonging. The mourners had learned a powerful lesson about seeing beyond appearances, and Mr. Johnson had been reminded that his actions, though once overlooked, had made a lasting impact. This story isn't just about one man, it's about all of us and the walls we build between each other. Let's choose to break those barriers and honor the humanity in everyone. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us at Life Stories for more heartfelt tales of resilience and hope. See you in the next video.